Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. Welcome to Blueprints, Chris. Introduce yourself to the audience.
Hey, y'all. I'm Chris Ramsaroop. I'm with Justice for Migrant Workers. I've been, organizing and an activist in farm worker issues for over 20 years now.
Wow. What is Justice for Migrant Workers? Tell us a little bit more about the organization.
Well, Justice or Justica for Migrant Workers, we began about 20 years ago. I used to work for the United Farm Workers of America, the UFW, and I also did some time at the Canadian Labour Congress. A couple of things that happened, right? So the UFW is pretty historic, and it's pretty, it's deeped and sort of steeped, I should say, in U.S. labor mythology. And they had an office here in Canada, but the office and the operations of the American Union was predominantly for what's happening in the U.S. and not for what's happening in rural Canada. And in 2001, I believe, which I can't believe I've said, it's scary to say, it's like 22
years ago.
It was 23 goddamn years ago. Anyways, there was a group of workers who organized a wildcat strike. Just in case if people don't know what a wildcat strike is, it's when people withhold their labor. It wasn't for anything, revolutionary. It was simply around a bloody kitchen and conditions in the kitchen, which led to the workers organizing this wildcat strike. And as a result of the wildcat strike, the workers were sent home. Repatriated is the term, the nice sanitized word that they use, is repatriation. And at that point, when I was at the UFW, we organized a series of delegations to Leamington, Ontario, where this action had taken place, as a fact-finding to find out what was going on. The UFW shut down at that point in time operations in Canada, and the CLC took over the Global Justice Caravan Project, and the United Food and Commercial Workers, who were undertaking legal challenges at that point in time, also became more interested in doing work around the Seasoned Agriculture Worker Program. So it's been a long haul. Things, of course, didn't end up rosy with us, many of us in labor. So we started our own organization, Justica, Justice for Migrant Workers, about 21 years ago. And it's an all-volunteer activist collective. It was a few of us rowdy types in Toronto that started it, predominantly both students and racialized workers. As time moved on, we became more incorporated with more former farm workers who have become members, and also farm workers and migrant workers across Ontario predominantly, but also people across Canada are involved with Justica one way or the other.
My ears perked up a little bit when you talked about a separation from labor there. Were you having difficulty getting migrant rights prioritized, over collective bargaining issues?
No, I think it's important for us to, a lot of times when we left, the traditional labor, a lot of times, and, you see this in a lot of the academic literature, but you also talk to all the old heads, all the old activists. A lot of times people always put this as a turf issue, right? These shit disturber activists just can't get along with the union. And that's always the way that it's positioned. But I think it's a larger systemic issue. And the way that a lot of traditional labor has looked at activist organizations, and particularly the demands or the ways of organizing that is undertaken. So I think a lot of the tensions came around through analysis, through frameworks, through trying to think through organizing. For example, it played out, and I'm sure peeps here know about unemployment insurance or EI. Traditionally, some segments of the labor union had tried to look at the idea of migrant workers, if they're not getting benefits of paying to the EI system, they shouldn't pay, right? And a lot of progressives back in the day bought into that, said that it seems fair that if a group of people are being discriminated against, then they shouldn't just pay into the system. Our position was very different. We're saying that, look, if workers are transnational, then workers should have the access to benefits, for example, when they're returning back to their home country. So not trying to cut off, but trying to expand entitlements to think beyond borders, right? So those traditional tensions were happening. Our focus was also trying to engage in multiracial organizing. And we saw that in hindsight, when we started, and to be frankly honest, when we started something years ago, we learned on the ground, right? We didn't know all the theories and everything else behind the emergence of the SOP program, the Seasoned Agricultural Worker Program, which is Canada's long-standing TFW program. It was learning as we organized and learning as activists, both from what we saw on the ground, but also what history informs us, and also what the academic literature at that time had also discussed. My long-standing thing, and why I'm saying all this kind of academic jumble, is the history of racial divisions and the history of the way that different segments of the working class have been used against each other. And we were well aware that any type of project that was going to be undertaken needed to be multiracial and to try to strive to organize both Mexican workers and Caribbean workers at that time. But now, as one comrade said, right now what employers have is they have the ability to pick and choose not only workers from the Mexico and the Caribbean, but workers from anywhere across the world to work in the fields of Ontario, for example. So thinking about a multiracial analysis, trying to stretch what the analysis was around entitlements, benefits, what organizing may look like, and thinking beyond the shop floor, right? To think about something different about this. And this is where history, of course, through indentured labor, really informs the way that many of us look at the way that SOP or the TFW programs operate today.
Let's talk about that organizing, because this is not your typical workplace. You've already given us examples of reprisals. If folks heard our last Rabble rant where we went on about temporary foreign worker exploitation, they'll know that it's very common to see workers repatriated or otherwise punished. They don't really fall under many of the labor laws that we experience, and they're new to the country, relatively far from home, in a really exploitive position. I imagine organizing those workers looks a little bit different than your average workplace. How do you do that safely?
Excellent question. All right, so let me just get back to what those restrictions are. If peeps don't know, particularly the Seasoned Agricultural Worker Program, the Low-Skilled Agricultural Program, pilot project as well, workers are tied to an employer. They do not have labor and social mobility. There is no access to permanent residency, and they must return at the end of the season or the end of their contract. For SOP workers, it's up to 8 months a year. For the low-skilled stream, it is up to 2 years, right, of working in Canada. So there is, first of all, immigration restrictions, where you're tied to one employer, no labor and social mobility, the constant threat of being disbarred and constant threat of being no longer able to work in Canada, coupled with agricultural laws or labor laws in Ontario where it's illegal to form a union. Agricultural workers are exempt from most provisions of the Employment Standards Act, most provisions of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Let me just actually say that again. There's no industry-specific regulations under the Health and Safety Act. And the workers' compensation system also discriminates against workers through practices such as deeming. So it's many of us would consider that this is not just people falling through the cracks. The program's been designed this particular way to disempower, disenfranchise a group of people. And it basically prospers and thrives through these immigration restrictions, through tied work permits, and through these multiple myriad exclusions of provincial labor laws. So it operates in a gray zone. And, the shock and awe that people love to watch and see is the housing conditions. And of course, I'm being facetious when we talk about that. They're like, oh my God, well, why is this happening? I can't believe this is Canada. Oh my God. And then you got the federal and provincial government pointing their middle fingers at each other. And the housing situation, it typifies, right? This is symbolizes what is wrong with the SOP program. It's where nobody has any real jurisdiction and there's no accountability. And COVID just basically showed why migrant housing is a recipe for disaster and why people are living in such shitty conditions. Even if conditions were not good, because there's so congregated, the fact that there's no protections under the Residential Tenancy Act or the health and safety laws, it's very different living in a bunkhouse as opposed to, and I'm sorry for using the comparison, but if you're working the tar sands, right, and the situations there that those workers are facing are very different different, right? This comparativeness of a seasonal workforce or a temporary labor force that have to live together, very, very different conditions and protections are provided between both aspects. Now, having said that, I think a lot of times people be like, well, how do you organize, and why do you even bother?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you just call for the abolition of people? And I just want to clarify what
do they mean? You mean just we should not use temporary?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, people are just like, just abolish the program and forget that, forget it, or that it's just too difficult. Mm-hmm. So screw this. And it's not just coming from the reactionaries, right? There's a lot of progressives who struggle with this, right? And they think about, and this is where nation states and borders come into this conversation. People seem to forget, or they erase that, this global relationship, or this imperialist relationship between global North and global South, and what leads people to come to Canada. It's just not that people are choosing this mythical Canadian American dream, but there's, these larger economic, social, political, and colonial factors that are pushing people to come to Canada. So that if you just simply abolish this program, people ain't going to have no jobs, right? As a result of these other economic and political factors that people seem to forget about. Or the relationship between good pensions and the fact that our pensions are investing in the economic destruction of people in the global South, right? Through mining, industrial agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. So this larger conversation it's very... there's many spaces to have these conversations with workers, right? And I think this is what's one of the beautiful parts about this type of work and organizing. And even though it's shrouded a lot of times in secrecy, there's the spaces where we are able to bring forth these conversations to talk about global imperialism, colonialism, and why people are coming to Canada. Now, I want to park that for a little second and talk about how does this happen. Most times, and you approach people from the first couple of times, they're going to be scared shitless of you. They're not going to talk to you, right? So they've got to see trust. They've got to see you coming forward. They got to see what you're going to do for workers, and not just simply talk the hot talk, right? So, over years, talking with workers, building relationships, building trust, trying to deal small, basic material outcomes or material benefits that we'll try to address with workers. It's about building trust, right? It's about building these longer-term relationships. It's about people seeing you, week after week or every couple weeks, not thinking that you're just here to research a population or to get something out of it. Upon my reflection, I do a lot of, media work or TV work and all that type of stuff. At the end of the day, that shit don't matter, right? When you're going with workers, you've got to be straight up. They don't care about any of that type of stuff. And that's like the most beautiful experience. They want to know what you're going to do. They want to have these tough conversations, right? About what's happening. What are the possibilities? So part of Justicia's work is about, showing what options are, trying to think about what solidarity means. And I want to actually just give a caveat here too. It's not that we're going in and organizing workers, right? We're not going in there and trying to say that we're going to save workers or we know their shit. Like all these wildcat strikes that have happened right from the beginning to now, it's workers who've been undertaking these actions themselves. And I think as allies, we need to figure out how do we build and show that support and solidarity after these actions take place? How does it become part of a living memory, not only for the general public or for the progressives, but for other workers? And to see about why, in this particular case, the potency of wildcat strikes are what is necessary to move forward, right? So part of the work, once again, about building solidarity, building long-term trust, building relationships, being upfront about what can and can't be done, and then trying to develop, supports during crises, right? Which is always difficult.
You mentioned emergency supports on your website. What do those look like?
Yeah.
I mean, I sometimes think in emergency supports that would be material needs, immediate housing, or...
Yeah, for every progressive organization, I think, or radical organization, the challenge is how do you make sure that you don't fall into the pitfalls of charity? And what I mean by that, it's, finding housing, emergency housing for people, right? Paying for data, right? Internet data, getting food during COVID. COVID showed the entire world, but people are still going hungry. If people are facing immediate immigration needs and if there's a possibility to help, and that support, if it's available, then try to have that as well too. But mostly housing, support for rent, food, getting people out of dangerous conditions. Injured workers, it's a lot more difficult because many of them are back at their home country. So those are the immediate material benefits. And then we just tried not to think of this as charity, but trying to show the systemic. So many of our comrades, Jessica Ponting, for instance, who also works at IAVGO, which is a workers' compensation legal clinic, when we, if there's a GoFundMe or fundraiser, right, it's about shaming the state or shaming workers' compensation system for its failures to support workers, right? So it's about also with these immediate needs to show the failures of the state as well, too. But yeah, it's one of these things that we all need to reflect on, right, as we're trying to organize, because we all go through this, right? Particularly people who are, vulnerable communities or marginalized communities, when they don't have access to OW or ODSP or stipends for rent or stipends for food. We've got to figure out other ways of trying to support that when it happens. And unfortunately, particularly this time of the year, as harvest season approaches, this is the roughest time.
Santiago, now that you've come in and collected yourself, I wanted to also mention Chris teaches everyday politics in food. He's a professor. That's one of his classes. Because we've said on our earlier shows that migrant workers feed cities. And Chris, you mentioned that some people say, just stop the program. And in a perfect world, people don't need to leave their homes for 8 months out of the year and send money back, right? They do stay and work close to home, 15-minute cities, right? Like that is the outcome, but we know that's not the reality. So you're working with what you've got. That is our reality. But can you give us an idea of how much we rely on seasonal workers here in Canada? Like how... I know I live in a rural community. I see it with my eyes when I drive by the fields. But urban folks might not have a real grasp. They envision farmers as though they are drawn in children's books, right? White men with straw hats and working just by themselves and their kin. That is not what most Ontario farms look like. Really, like what are these numbers of workers that we're trying to protect?
There's at least 50 to 60,000 TFWs, temporary foreign workers. Mostly are, as I said beforehand, we've got two streams of agriculture workers. One is a season agriculture worker program, which employs workers from several Caribbean countries and Mexico. The agricultural stream could be any country under the sun. The season agriculture worker is restricted to several commodities, specific commodities. The 2-year contract or the low-skilled agricultural project, mushrooms, worm pickers, cannabis workers, year-round productions, chicken catchers, you'd find that group of people in that category. I think it's important for us also to just be straight up. Don't believe the hype. Our agricultural system isn't to feed Canadians, in quotations. It's a industrial agricultural system that's premised on export production. Canadian greenhouses, for instance, are simply Amazons. They're Amazon production facilities. They're not these little mom and pop shops. And, over the last several decades, we've continued to see a consolidation of the industry. And I think the most recent thing I saw on CBC about 2 or 3 months ago, just in Ontario alone, the value of land of Ontario's agricultural industry is about $120 billion. And that's just mushroomed over the pandemic, right? So it's, tremendously wealthy, tremendously powerful. Most of the crops and the commodities that agricultural workers from the Caribbean, Mexico, or the Global South are working on are for export, predominantly for the United States, but also for Asia as well, and also Mexico. So, the most poignant scene that I remember, if audiences remember the documentary, Stephanie Black's documentary Life and Debt, about the implications of global economic restructuring in the country of Jamaica, you've got a scene where apples are being sold in Jamaica. And I could just only, and just the way that they're set up, and these are apples from Ontario, and predominantly those are probably apples that were picked by Jamaican workers here in Ontario that are then being sold to people in Jamaica. So you've got this kind of triangle that's just this kind of really vicious psycho triangle that's happening.
I don't even know how to react to all of this, to be honest, because it's all just such, like it's such a web of garbage. Like every single aspect of this is so horrible. The fact that we're not only exploiting people within our borders, we're also exploiting people outside, because like you said, we had a guest just yesterday because we were talking about farming, and I think they said that 76% of all food that we eat in Canada, we import. So the fact that there's still such a misconception about our agriculture, the fact that we're bringing people in just to exploit them for, I'm sorry, I don't even have a question. I'm just,
I think it's,
oh,
a lot of times what we focus on, and this is how I'm going to actually start my class on Thursday, we think of it's our fault, right? We think of just we're ignorant people, but there's millions and millions of dollars in marketing that's happening to promote so-called family farms, to promote this idea of buying local. And so this it's part of our national identity. We construct who is seen and who is unseen, right? And this mythology has been going on for generations. And as more pushback happens by activist organizations, by consumer advocates, for example, we're seeing this attempt to strengthen this mythology, right, and to erase any type of crisis or attempts to address the failures of our food system, right, or our labor system. So it's very much contested, but it's a lie. It's not our fault. And that's because of this mass propaganda machine that's happening to try to erase all the violence that exists in our foods.
Absolutely. I think the videos that we saw from the Jamaican workers that went viral just probably showed a glimpse, for reasons we all know, racism and other factors. We don't see those stories enough. We are not reminded enough just exactly how our food is grown. Our previous guests said, and I guess I'm paraphrasing, but basically it would be near impossible within the structure that we have now in Canada to run a profitable farm ethically. That the kind of conundrum that farmers are in, and the normalization of the temporary foreign workers program and the racism that's built into that program is then carried on through those employers and then experienced by the workers. And so is there a farming model? Like, can you point to examples that don't use, I guess, but the solution isn't not to use that labor, but you understand what I'm talking about, the way the farmers are not making any money in the way that it's designed right now, unless you're a huge corporation. So,
I don't have any, full answers. And I think I've been trying to learn. I'm not going to ever claim, even with the TFW stuff, I'm doing it so long. I'm not, I'm learning as I go along. But I think if we think food is a right, if we do believe that, if we believe in, developing a healthy food system, then we have to ask, can we have a system of food that's based on a capitalist model? I think that's first and foremost the first, challenge that we need to do. And I know, we would get laughed out of both spaces for even saying that. But clearly, in our talking with the enemy, we would raise it then. We'll get laughed there. But then, we have to ask ourselves, is the industrial model what's going to benefit and save us in the long run? And I think clearly it's not. I think it's going to be thinking about, how do we develop cooperative models? How do we move away from these large agricultural, operations that are hurting people, right? Both here and in the global south. And the other part about which, many of us haven't, and we need to talk more about, is the relationship between trade, migration, and labor. And the fact that our, trade policies, NAFTA 2.0, and the role that the industrial agriculture is playing in just trying to engaging more dumping and, trying to have this comparative and competitive advantage for Canadian produce, which is also destroying industries and agricultural food production the world over. Most recently, you might have saw, and I'm still trying to get up to speed on this, but Canada and the United States are trying to take steps to attack Mexico's prevention of the use of GMO products, right? So this is something else to kind of keep on our radar too, as well. So it's very much thinking about how do we develop a new food model, right, that's not based on capitalism. Thinking, David Bacon, who's an amazing activist and a journalist in California, was one of the people that introduced me to the concept. But, other people have used it beforehand. The right to move, the right to stay, where people are able to move and come, not being tied to a particular employer, right? So people having the ability to move and to live. And for people having the ability to have a sustainable food system in their own home country and not being, dumped on by, North American produce, but also not having American and Canadian actors, both non-governmental actors, but also corporations try to influence and monopolize and commodify local food production in the global south.
Short of system change, because
Yeah.
I mean, we're all here for that and working towards it in all the myriad of ways that work and don't work. But there are some more immediate demands that folks in your position are asking for to help migrant workers right now. Does that include for you status for all?
Yeah. Yeah. So, status for all, part of the reason why that was developed many years ago, well, first and foremost, as many of your audience may be aware, but English farm workers, when they came to Canada, didn't have any restrictions on them. After World War II, Dutch farm workers, when they came to Canada, came as permanent residents.
I'm sensing a theme.
Yeah, the Polish war veterans. I think they had a 1 or 2 year waiting period. It's only when we started, having migrant workers from the Caribbean, Jamaica first, the rest of the Caribbean, and Mexico afterwards, that we went to a tied work permit model. And we're saying that if workers, previous generations could, why couldn't we do that now?
Nothing screams slavery to me more than the timing of that restriction, because I was going to mention earlier, people need to imagine not really being able to quit. You have the worst boss and that's it. That's your only choice. Even though you've got the skill set to move to the next farm and they even have an opening, it won't matter. And this boss knows that. This whole relationship is built around these restrictions.
Yeah.
So the fact that it was tied to, once we had racialized migrant workers coming on the regular, and then we tied them to a piece of land and a very specific person, the semblance to the slavery that we regularly acknowledge is uncanny.
So I think a lot of us, Cindy Hamamovich, who's a U.S. historian, but actually I think she's from Toronto, if I'm not mistaken. She looks at this issue and she calls it indentured labor, right? That the SOP program or guest worker programs as a form of perpetual indentured labor, where workers, under the previous indentured labor programs that operate in the Caribbean, for example, workers were able to have freedom after 4 or 5 years. Under the current seasonal agricultural worker program, people could be working for generations and they would never be able to live here as permanent residents. So it's about trying to think about employers not being able to use temporary foreign worker programs or workers and to pit them against each other through tied work permits, or to continue to simply racially subjugate people as a result of immigration restrictions. And it's also to think about, the threat of democracy, when many people cannot participate freely in any form of democracy. And as we have more people coming to Canada as international students under tourist visas and as temporary foreign workers, they cannot contribute either through most forms of civic engagement. Agricultural workers are a perfect example where paternalism is steeped in the entire system, from the housing to the labor laws to the immigration laws, where the employer, we cannot forget that this is an employer-driven program. So a lot of times when people diss us, they're like, can't we all just get everybody together? And, can't we just, talk about, we need a balanced approach for this. Well, the program is not balanced, especially when it is employer-driven and here to meet the needs of employers, not to build communities. So the permanent status on arrival is critically important, right, to restructure the debate about who is coming to Canada and under what structures or how are they coming to Canada. And, definitely we cannot erase the role that race plays into this. And the fact that you had first, predominantly Black workers and then brown workers from Global South who've always been treated differently. And this is where the ideas of apartheid come into this, right? This unequalness, this racialized unequalness that exists through our TFW programs.
Interesting. Would you call that system apartheid?
Yes.
Sounds like it.
Yep. Absolutely. This is a form of apartheid. Yeah.
I don't think people realize just how few rights there are. I studied political science. I wrote a few papers on the temporary foreign worker program, and Chris has knocked off a few restrictions that I'm not aware of. And all of this makes for the breeding grounds of a really abusive relationship. We're so beyond the point of thinking we can leave it to bosses. There's no worker really that would would commiserate with that, They understand that minimum wage is there for a reason, because if your boss could pay you less, they would.
Mm-hmm.
And That whole system is built on the premise that the boss will take care of them and we won't really check up on it.
Yeah.
Quite often liberal governments will make improvements on systems after enough noise. And they're usually anything but. Right? I use scare quotes for. There is a mechanism in place for workers who are abused, who have a bad employer, but they literally carry around a scarlet letter with them afterwards. Do they not? Possible. But I read that and I laughed as if anyone could not see the problem with that. Basically, you walk around with a permit that says you complained about your old boss and you need a new job. Would you take me on? And I just can't see now being able to pick from anywhere in the world how any farmer would be like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I'll take you on.
Yes, so about 3 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, could be up to 4 years ago. I don't remember exactly. 3 or 4 years ago, the federal government introduced something called the Vulnerable Open Work Permit for workers facing abuses or victimization. So very much it creates the what I think is important to remember, as I said before, people are indentured to their employer. So it's not an exception about the victimization or abuse, but it's built in fundamentally to the system that exists. So it also requires workers to come forward to try to file complaints, which need to have lots of evidence. They're going to need some type of legal support. And unfortunately, there is an entire industry that's set up to help people now, where workers have to pay lots of money to get these free vulnerable open work permits. If a worker is successful in getting it, it's only good for up to a year in most cases. And very much after the open permit ends, it's incumbent on the worker to find another closed permit or to try to find some other ways to regularize their status. So it's going from unfreedom to limited freedom to unfreedom. And very much it looks at the workers as the exception, right? And look at these workers who are filing for these cases as an exception. It's downloading the responsibility on the state onto, organizations, activist organizations, non-government organizations. What we're also seeing is that through the implementation of these vulnerable open work permits, absolutely, workers are not going to be able to find work if you've stood up against your employer. There is this kind of disbarring, right, of workers. And, anecdotally, even before this vulnerable open work permit existed, workers would tell us that allegedly their names would be called out, right? And they would not be allowed to find any work in a farming community. And I've heard this from several workers who talked about their experiences prior to the inception of the vulnerable open work permit. So in June, we had a protest in Windsor targeting their local member of parliament. And we brought many workers who had open permits to basically raise concerns about this process, right? And the fact that they're screwed. They would either be undocumented afterwards at the risk of deportation, or they have to go into an exploitative indentured contract again. So it's really, really kind of mind-boggling on one side, but it just perpetuates this racist idea that of this community, right? Of when they're trying to stand up against injustices. Just a last, point about this is that we've I'm an activist of Justice for Migrant Workers, and we've also set up a legal clinic in partnership with the University of Windsor, and our staff lawyer, who's also a member of Justice for Migrant Workers, Tanita Doma, she's been doing a lot of this work to champion and push a lot of the vulnerable open work permits. So she's been doing phenomenal work of trying to get workers open work permits, but it's also about not just getting the permits, but also addressing the failures, but also at the same time trying to think about this limited fucked up system, to think about how do we organize with these workers to try to push for changes. So not just thinking about it as a policy or like some type of advocacy, but thinking about it as an organizing opportunity as well.
I guess that brings us back to the wildcat strikes that you advocate for. I have trouble with that, right? Because we've seen the workers repatriated. Not that we don't advocate for being disruptive on this show. It's in the name. But these workers are the most vulnerable that I can imagine at the moment, other than perhaps maybe completely undocumented. But even then, it's not a contest. I imagine they would all be sent home. Like there is nothing that protects them, right? And even the act of acting as a union there is illegal for them, is it not?
Yeah, it's illegal to form unions in Ontario. And it's tremendous risks, right? So going back 20 something years ago, with the first wildcat that we knew of, but there's always been wildcats, right? Let me just be clear. People have always been withholding their labor. It's just 20 years ago when we were involved, we found out about it by accident. So I think, workers are going to continue to undertake actions when it's the most egregious actions of their employers. Or sometimes the most mundane. In this particular case, workers had to live with sewage and feces, right? Because their toilets were being clogged. We also saw the way that the employer was talking to the workers in these videos as well, too. So, I think a lot of times workers are making these calculated choices themselves about what happens. And what they're going to do to stand up for their employers. So I think as allies, it's thinking about when that happens, what can be done. And even if those workers are gone home now, what steps can be done to show solidarity? How do we ensure that they will not be disbarred from the program? But also what's important, and I have to be straight up here, right? This is not like the workers undertook a lot of the media themselves. They've organized the actions themselves. And they've also been trying to organize, to talk to their political elected officials in their home country as well, too. So workers are not just these empty vessels, right? They're finding ways to navigate, and they're trying to find ways to address these particular situations. When we're coming in to show support, we have to make sure that we're not adding more fuel to the fire. And going back to what I said beforehand, in a situation, if workers are going to be, and we find out beforehand that a wildcat's going to take place, it's about trying to, work through different options with peeps to figure out how best to address A, B, C, and D.
You hold workshops, I imagine, to teach workers their rights, or if they have any here in Canada, or...
I want to go back to something you said, which was really interesting about minimum wage. And what was really poignant about the whole, when the provincial Liberal government here in Ontario introduced minimum wage increases. And of course, we didn't see the same thing under Ford, but this kind of false consciousness that was happening in different workplaces, these captive audience meetings, and I'm going to put those in air quotes. So where employers, supervisors would be denouncing any minimum wage increases, right? And I'm sure we see this in a lot of workplaces where it was,
You mean to the staff?
Yes, right?
Not just Galen Weston in the media.
Yes, exactly, to the staff,
to the
right?
workers,
So
okay.
this idea, and workers start getting to indoctrinate about this, oh my God, this is actually bad for me, right? This is going to be really bad for me. And then we see employers taking particular tactics of shifting hours, et cetera, to address this type of stuff. So it's very, very easy to fall into this false consciousness narrative. Part of the so-called workshops that we're underdoing is not just simply about looking at know your rights, but trying to understand history, trying to think through analysis, and the film screenings, right? So this film I talked about, Life and Debt, or the struggle of South Asian workers, A Time to Rise. So trying to think and trying to contest and challenge the way that workers are being told or how they're positioned, trying to also counter whatever the bosses tell them about themselves and getting them to develop their own narratives and analysis about how to address situations. And in many cases, also building confidence, right? So, and I don't mean this in kind of like a rickety-rah, you're so rah, but after this incident happened, in Jamaica, for instance, the workers were being alleged to just mash up the program. What that basically means is that they're just trying to destroy the program for other future workers because they did this wildcat strike because they exposed these bad conditions.
Because they're stirring the pot.
Exactly. And this was a very powerful narrative that was playing out. And the workers all knew this was bullshit, right? And it was just trying to work with them to continue to this, look, they all knew that, no, they're not there to...
They should have come back working class heroes.
Yes. Exactly. Right. And other workers should be looking at that too. So it's even just building with that and to reassure them that there's other people who do believe what you just said. They are working class heroes.
I want to write them a letter.
Yeah.
That would be so hard to do that, to find that courage to stand up to your employer in that situation, be sent home and feel that kind of heat. But that's the reality of the working class, consciousness that we need to build.
Okay, so how about this? Okay, that's a phenomenal idea. Why don't we do this as a first step, right? So we're going to talk about the larger structural, so there's large actions that are going to be happening on status on arrival. We're also looking at some other actions around this particular situation, other workplace injustices. But if peeps want to even just do a letter to those workers, to all the workers who took part in the strike, the audience could send it to both Jessa and to Santiago, and then you send it to me. And we'll get it to peeps.
I love that because I really do. It angered us enough to do it on our rant, but you've given us a kind of a different perspective on just what it took to kind of get there.
Yeah.
And then the repercussions. So absolutely, I would be happy to forward anything I get on to you. And if that bolsters just even a tiny segment of workers who are doing the right thing, it's the least I can do. So tell us about the big events, because September is a big month for Status for All. And for those, we didn't really get into it, but Status for All, status on arrival, is full immigration status for people who come to work here.
Yeah, so it's mostly the Migrant Worker Alliance for Change and the Migrant Rights Network are organizing those actions across Canada. We're going to be doing some specific actions in support of status on arrival, but also around injured migrant workers, right? Workers who are being fired, and to look at different actions pressuring other components of the food chain to have and to show support for these workers as well too. So definitely people should be supporting these actions, but also keep an eye out for some of the work that we're going to be doing, particularly with this one employer, but some other cases that are happening. Some people might be aware that we recently won a huge human rights case against the Ontario Provincial Police. I'm not sure if you know about this or no.
I'll let you. I read it in my digging of you, and we always love to share victories. Santiago needs one right now.
Yeah, so kudos to the workers and to Shane Martinez, who was a lawyer in that case. 10 years ago, there was a racial profiling incident after a woman was violently sexually assaulted. A general description was given. The Ontario Provincial Police did a DNA sweep where it didn't matter what anybody looked like. They took their DNA. They lied to the workers that they would destroy their DNA samples, which they never did. First, working and we thought about the OIPRD, the Office of the Independent Police Review Director, to examine systemic issues. And then a human rights case was filed for 54 workers. The HRTO decision came back about a year ago and showed that the province and the OPP racially discriminated against these workers, and they preyed on their vulnerable status because they're tied to an employer. It also talked about who defines a community, and migrant workers are never seen as part of their communities, right? As they're basically seen as extensions of the employer's property. There was a settlement because there was supposed to be a second part of the systemic case where, first time in Canadian history, DNA was destroyed. This DNA samples were kept at the Center for Forensic Science here in Toronto. When we started this thing, they said that would never happen, would never be able to destroy any DNA samples. It did.
But that was your goal, right?
Yeah, right from the beginning.
This is not a covering up of evidence.
Yeah. Yes.
You demand...
Yeah.
The workers demanded that their DNA not be stored after all of this.
This was their main baby, right? They wanted their damn DNA destroyed. That happened, right? Not just for the 54, but for all 96 workers. There's a class action lawsuit happening for maybe 7,000 to 12,000 other people. They found out that that's how many people's DNA samples are being kept in this database. Yeah, so I think the other thing is that, the way particularly and it's always happened, but right now there's this more kind of liberal, nuanced, racist xenophobia that's happening around housing, for instance, right? And say we've got too many immigrants, we have too many international students.
Even from so-called progressives, I have seen the anti-immigration argument centered on housing.
Yeah, it's been more than, and we can talk about that another time. But the idea about this organizing is to show that the most vulnerable population here, these workers, fought for and they won. But the significance of the victory doesn't just simply benefit them, but benefit wide segments of our society. So that's been also part of the organizing as well, too, looking at particular material benefits, addressing the unique situation of these workers and this community, but also thinking about what other widespread ways could be beneficial for us as working class people.
It's always good to win a case against the cops, too.
Yeah, totally.
Victories are so important. And even you talk about the movie nights, and at first it kind of sounds superficial, but for those who listen to our tenant union organizing Blueprints of a Rent Strike, it's a very similar model, right? Make contact, find common ground, but then also be shown victories. There needs to be that courage instilled. Sometimes it doesn't just come from within. The barriers that they face are too deep, but sometimes simple things like that really do fuel the necessary fire, as well as victories in court, which are very hard won to get a court to acknowledge racial profiling or that racism exists. what would a grand victory look like for justice for migrant workers? If you got status for all, status on arrival, would that be enough?
No. No, I think it's always ongoing. And I guess my reflection is if we win, there's always one step forward, two steps back. So I think it's when we win, how do we prepare ourselves for when the two steps back happen? I think it's got to be, there's got to be the ability to move and stay, access to benefits and entitlements such as EI or workers' comp or pensions, EI or pensions at the federal level, provincial entitlements such as workers' compensation through the WSIB system. But it's also sectoral organizing, right? So thinking not just of organizing a union at one specific employer, but something that's sectoral and transnational as well too. So I think it's very much about transformation. And I think that's always going to be that's kind of this larger vision, right? About how do we change our food system? How do we change working conditions? And how do we ensure that workers, go home, they work in decent conditions, but they go home to their families at the end of the seasons?
Would status for all essentially open up the door to more safely do more of that work? I imagine if they had landed status, they would then be allowed to unionize, or would the same...
I think
bit by bit.
I think it's going to be simultaneous. We have to get away from where the province and the feds are too busy pointing their fingers at each other. And I think a lot of times, unfortunately, we have organizing or campaign models where we focus on one goal. In this particular situation, I would encourage people to think outside of that box and to think about organizing simultaneously for provincial and federal changes. And even if they're not, I think a lot of times we want to focus on winnable. We have to be dreamers. I think always dreamers, because the far right is dreaming and they're getting what they want. They're not being pragmatic. They're getting what they want at anything. So we've got to also, I think, even more so, right? Be dreaming, being idealistic, and thinking about what do we want, right? And not being shy of saying it or doing it.
To be honest, I'm a little speechless on this topic. I don't even know what to contribute because it feels so frustratingly massive. It's food, basic thing that we all need to survive, and it's every part of it is so wrapped up in this and with just everything else that we talk about on this show. It's just I don't know, right? Today it's feeling overwhelming, not gonna lie.
I feel you, because this is just one component of the food chain that we were talking about, that the food supply, but they're human beings. So it is just so very complex, and especially talking about the farming industry last week, our audience, it'll be last week, but for us it was just yesterday. And so for somebody so passionate about food insecurity as Santiago is, it is kind of a bit overwhelming.
I think, let's look at these wildcats as even though the repatriations happened, they were sticking it to the man. They were sticking it to the system. And the way that I always end on this, imagine that this population who could face the ultimate sacrifices of not ever being able to work again are standing up for the right fight. That should be a call to action for all of us across the food chain and all across, all segments of the working class, that there is possibility, right? There is, change is happening and change will happen. And it's not naive to say that we win. It's not being, just simply kind of this public relations talk about we win all the time. No, winning comes from struggle. And I think that's what my last message is. A lot of times things do seem to be horrible and tough, but these small segments of what people are doing should be rallying cries for all of us.
And so they shall be.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.